Welcome to Karen Stories, where the wildest Karen encounters unfold. Get ready for hilarious, unbelievable, and shocking moments as Karens make the most outrageous demands. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to never miss a crazy story. Let's dive in. Oscar had just wrapped up a long, exhausting day at work. The kind where the weight of deadlines, expectations, and silent battles with discrimination pressed against his shoulders, leaving him craving nothing but a moment of peace. And peace, to him, meant a walk with Jack. His golden retriever had been his unwavering companion since puppyhood, a source of comfort on even the most unbearable days. The cool evening air carried the soft scent of pine as they strolled down the familiar suburban streets. Jack's tail wagged, his golden fur shimmering under the dim glow of streetlights. Oscar allowed himself to sink into the moment, the rhythmic tapping of Jack's paws on the pavement, the distant hum of crickets, the occasional laughter spilling from a nearby home. It was a simple pleasure, one that reminded him of the good in the world. But peace was a fragile thing. It shattered the moment a voice sliced through the air, laced with condescension and disdain. "Hey, what do you think you're doing walking that thing around here?" Oscar stopped mid-step. The words hung heavy, cutting through the tranquility like a jagged blade. He turned, his brow furrowing as he met the glare of a woman standing a few feet away. She had the kind of posture that screamed entitlement, arms crossed, chin lifted, a tight scowl curling her lips. The silk blouse she wore, crisp and pristine, only added to the sense of manufactured superiority that radiated from her like an invisible force field. Jack, oblivious to the tension in the air, sat beside Oscar, his tongue lolling out in a carefree pant. But Oscar could feel the weight of her gaze shifting between him and his dog, her expression twisted into something unmistakable. Disgust. "Excuse me?" Oscar's voice was steady, though he already felt the familiar heat of frustration creep up his spine. "Karen, because. Who else could she be?" Took a step closer, undeterred by his incredulity. "You heard me. Why don't you just put that thing down? People like you shouldn't have nice things." Oscar felt his fingers curl into fists at his sides. He had dealt with moments like this before, the barely concealed racism, the way privilege emboldened people like her to police who belonged and who didn't. But something about this particular encounter struck a nerve. Maybe it was the audacity of her words. Maybe it was the sheer arrogance in the way she stood before him, convinced of her own righteousness. Jack, sensing the shift in his owner's demeanor, pressed against Oscar's leg, offering silent support. "Jack is my dog," Oscar said, his voice calm but firm. "He's well trained, gentle, and loved. He belongs here just as much as I do." Karen scoffed, rolling her eyes with exaggerated disdain. "Oh, please. I bet you didn't even train him properly. Dogs like that get aggressive. He could snap at any moment." Oscar's patience frayed. He had spent years raising Jack with kindness, ensuring he was nothing but a beacon of loyalty and affection. Yet here was this woman, this stranger, determined to paint both of them as something they weren't. Still, Oscar knew better than to engage further. So he took a breath, exhaled slowly, and turned to walk away. But Karen wasn't finished. "Don't think you can just walk through here like you own the place," she muttered, loud enough for him to hear. Oscar clenched his jaw, forcing himself to keep moving. But a nagging feeling settled deep in his gut. He knew women like her. He knew how entitlement mixed with prejudice could become dangerous. And as he heard the unmistakable sound of a phone being pulled out, followed by a venomous voice dialing 911, he realized this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Oscar's steps were steady, but his heart was pounding. He wanted to ignore her, to keep moving, to pretend she was just another passing nuisance in a world filled with far too many Karens. But the sharp, venomous tone of her voice, as she barked into her phone, froze him in place. "There's a dangerous man with an aggressive dog." Karen's voice rang out, loud and panicked. "I'm scared for my safety. He's threatening me." Oscar turned slowly, his blood boiling. She was pointing at him, her phone clutched tightly in one hand, the other gesturing wildly as if she were trying to paint a scene of absolute terror. Jack, ever the calm and loyal companion, simply sat by Oscar's side, his tail wagging slightly, oblivious to the chaos unraveling around him. This wasn't just an overreaction. This wasn't just ignorance. This was calculated. Oscar had seen it before, the weaponization of white tears, the carefully orchestrated performance designed to summon the full weight of law enforcement upon black men like him. He had watched the viral videos, the headlines, the tragic endings. And now, it was happening to him. "Are you serious?" Oscar's voice was tight with controlled rage. "Jack hasn't done anything. I haven't done anything." Karen ignored him, her voice rising in exaggerated distress. "Yes. Right now. He's in the park, he's walking toward me. He looks angry. I don't know what he's going to do." Oscar felt his fists clench involuntarily. He could feel the weight of her words pressing down on him, trying to suffocate him with the force of their implications. She wasn't just trying to get him to leave. She was trying to paint him as a monster, as a threat, as a man who needed to be subdued. A cold wave of dread washed over him. He could already see how this could play out. The sirens, the flashing lights, the officers arriving, guns drawn, barking orders before he even had a chance to explain. He had heard the stories. He had seen the videos where men like him never got the benefit of the doubt, where words like Karen's became a loaded gun aimed straight at their lives. But Oscar refused to cower. "Put the phone down," he said, his voice low but firm. "You're making a mistake." Karen's eyes widened, as if she had finally gotten the reaction she wanted. "Oh my God, he's getting aggressive." She shrieked into the phone. "He's trying to come at me, hurry. Please." Oscar let out a slow breath, his pulse hammering against his ribs. He knew better than to move. Any sudden action, any attempt to take out his own phone, could be twisted into something dangerous. So instead, he stayed exactly where he was, staring at her with a steady gaze, as she continued her theatrical performance for the dispatcher on the other end of the line. A few passers-by had stopped now, their eyes darting between Oscar and Karen, uncertain of what they were witnessing. Some looked uncomfortable, shifting awkwardly, as if they could feel the ugliness of the situation pressing in around them. But no one intervened. No one spoke up. The wail of approaching sirens cut through the air. Karen's lips curled into something almost triumphant as she stepped back, as if she were already preparing to point the finger when the officers arrived. Oscar, however, refused to let her control the narrative. If she wanted to play this game, then she was going to learn that not every black man would bow under the weight of her accusations. Without a word, Oscar reached into his pocket and slowly, deliberately, pulled out his phone. He unlocked it with one hand, holding it up so that the camera captured everything: her frantic expression, her still tensed posture, the perfectly calm golden retriever sitting at his side. "Say it again," he said, his voice firm. "Tell them I'm threatening you. Tell them Jack is dangerous. Say it while the camera's rolling." For the first time, Karen hesitated. Her fingers tightened around her phone, her bravado flickering ever so slightly. She had expected him to shrink, to panic, to stumble over his own words in a desperate attempt to defend himself. She had not expected him to stand his ground, to fight back with nothing but the truth. The sirens grew louder. Any second now, the police would arrive. Oscar squared his shoulders and stood tall, unshaken. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The sirens grew deafening, flashing red and blue lights bouncing off the surrounding houses, cutting through the peaceful night like a violent warning. Oscar stood still, his breath steady, his grip tightening around his phone as he kept the camera trained on Karen. He had no intention of letting this moment slip away into ambiguity. Karen, on the other hand, straightened up, her panic suddenly shifting into a controlled display of victimhood. As the first police cruiser screeched to a stop, she stepped forward, waving her arms frantically. The performance had begun. "Officers, thank God you're here," she cried, her voice trembling with well-rehearsed fear. "That man, he threatened me. He has a dangerous dog. I was just walking, and he started getting aggressive. I thought he was going to sick that thing on me." Oscar could feel his pulse in his throat, but he remained motionless, knowing all too well that one wrong move, one misinterpreted gesture, could escalate this into something far worse. Two officers stepped out of their vehicle, hands resting near their holsters as they took in the scene. The lead officer, a tall man with sharp eyes and a weathered face, took a measured step forward. His partner, a woman with cropped dark hair, followed closely, scanning the area, her gaze landing briefly on Jack, who sat obediently at Oscar's side. "Sir," the lead officer said, his tone firm, but not yet hostile. "We received a call about a possible threat. Mind telling us what's going on here?" Oscar exhaled slowly, lifting his phone slightly. "I think it would be better if you saw for yourself," he said evenly. "I recorded everything." Karen's expression flickered just for a second, but it was enough. The officers exchanged a glance. The female officer turned to Karen, arms crossed. "Ma'am, can you clarify exactly what happened?" Karen hesitated for the briefest moment, before regaining her composure. "I already told you," she insisted, her voice cracking at just the right moment. "I was walking, and then he came out of nowhere. His dog, it looks nice, but I know these kinds of dogs. They can be unpredictable. I was scared, and then he started threatening me when I called for help." The female officer crouched slightly, extending a hand toward Jack. The golden retriever sniffed her fingers before giving her a friendly lick. A small, knowing smile flickered across her lips. "He doesn't seem very aggressive to me," she murmured. Karen's face turned red. "You don't understand. People like him, She caught herself mid-sentence, but it was too late. The weight of her words lingered in the air, thick with implication. Oscar arched a brow. "People like me?" he echoed, his voice dangerously quiet. The lead officer sighed, rubbing his temple. "Sir, may I see your recording?" Oscar nodded and handed over his phone, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. The officer played the video, his expression hardening as Karen's shrill voice filled the night air. The accusations. The blatant lies. The smugness that had vanished the moment she realized she was being recorded. Karen fidgeted, as the officer's jaw tightened. The female officer, still petting Jack, let out a low whistle. "Well," she said, standing up and dusting off her knees, "that certainly tells a different story." Karen's eyes darted between them, panic seeping into her once confident facade. You don't understand," she stammered. "I was just..." The lead officer cut her off. "Ma'am," he said, his voice colder now, "it looks like you've made a false report to law enforcement." Karen's breath hitched. "No, he." The female officer stepped forward, arms crossed. "Lying to 911 is a serious offense. You wasted police resources, and you deliberately attempted to paint an innocent man as a criminal." She tilted her head. "You do realize what could have happened to him if we had arrived here thinking he was actually a threat, don't you?" Oscar said nothing, but the unspoken truth hung between them like a storm cloud. Karen opened her mouth, then closed it, her face drained of color. The reality of her situation was sinking in, and for the first time that night, she looked genuinely afraid. "You're under arrest," the lead officer stated, pulling out his handcuffs, "for filing a false police report and causing public disturbance." "No," Karen gasped. "You can't." The click of metal around her wrist silenced her. Oscar exhaled, watching as they led her toward the squad car, her protests falling on deaf ears. Justice, for once, had arrived swiftly. And this time, Karen wasn't the one holding the power. Karen's breath hitched as cold steel closed around her wrists. The sharp click of the handcuffs seemed to echo in the quiet suburban night, a sound so final, so undeniable, that for the first time, real fear flickered in her wide, disbelieving eyes. This is a mistake," she sputtered, twisting against the officer's grip as they tightened the cuffs around her. "You don't understand. I was just trying to protect myself." The female officer, the one who had knelt to pet Jack just moments ago, let out a dry laugh, shaking her head. "Protect yourself from what, exactly?" she asked, her voice laced with skepticism. "From a man minding his own business? From a dog who's done nothing but sit there wagging his tail?" Karen's lips parted, but no words came out. Her gaze darted around frantically, searching for support, for someone to step forward and validate her lie. But the onlookers, some neighbors, some strangers, only stared in muted silence. They had heard the accusations. They had seen the footage. And now, they saw her for what she truly was. A fraud, a coward, a woman so consumed by her own entitlement that she had been willing to put another man's life in jeopardy, with nothing more than a fabricated phone call. The lead officer's voice cut through the thick tension like a blade. "Ma'am. You're under arrest for filing a false police report, harassment, and public endangerment." His tone was flat, matter of fact, as though he had dealt with people like her before, people who weaponized their privilege, their fear, to control situations that never belonged to them. Karen thrashed in protest. No, you don't get it. He was looking at me aggressively. His dog." The officer tightened his grip on her arm. "Enough." His patience had run dry. "We've seen the footage. You've wasted police time and resources. You tried to ruin an innocent man's life tonight." Oscar stood a few feet away, silent, his face unreadable. His phone was still in his hand, the screen dark now, but the evidence had already done its job. He had won, not in the way he had ever wanted to, but in the way that mattered. The truth had cut through the noise, and for once, justice wasn't turning a blind eye. Karen twisted once more, turning toward Oscar, her face contorted with a desperation that had nothing to do with remorse. "Say something," she demanded, her voice breaking. "Tell them I didn't mean it like that." "You know I didn't mean it like that." Oscar met her gaze, his expression unreadable. He had nothing to say. What words could possibly be given to a woman who had nearly cost him his freedom or worse? What apology could she craft now that would undo the weight of her actions? The female officer let out a quiet scoff, shaking her head. "He doesn't owe you anything." Karen's breath shuddered out in shallow gasps. As the reality of the situation closed in on her, she looked around again, searching for a savior who wasn't there, a justification that didn't exist. The smugness that had painted her features earlier was gone now, replaced by something else, something raw and ugly. Fear. The officers began leading her toward the squad car, and as they did, Oscar finally moved. Not toward her, but toward Jack. who had remained calm through the entire ordeal. He crouched down, running a hand through the golden fur of his companion. Jack nuzzled against him, as if sensing the weight that had finally lifted. Karen's voice rose once more, frantic and shrill. "I was just scared. I didn't know." The officer guiding her into the car shut the door before she could finish. The silence that followed was heavy, but this time, it was a different kind of quiet. Not the kind that preceded injustice, but the kind that settled in after it had been confronted and exposed. Oscar stood, exhaling slowly as he watched the patrol car pull away, its flashing lights disappearing into the night. He didn't feel triumph. There was no celebration to be had in watching someone be taken away in cuffs. But there was relief. Relief that, for once, the system had worked as it should have. That Karen's lies had not been enough to twist reality in her favor. Jack licked his hand, and Oscar let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It was over. And this time, the right person had lost. The news spread like wildfire. By the time Karen's mugshot hit the local headlines, her once pristine reputation had already begun to crumble. The footage of her fabricated distress call had made its way onto social media, where the internet wasted no time in dissecting every racist, entitled inflection in her voice. Within hours, the story of HOA Karen had gone viral. The hashtag Justice for Oscar trending across multiple platforms. Neighbors who had once exchanged pleasantries with Karen now found themselves re-evaluating every interaction they'd ever had with her. And they weren't alone. The Homeowners Association, the very organization she had so proudly flaunted, held an emergency meeting. Within 24 hours, her position was revoked. Karen, once the self-appointed enforcer of community standards, was now the outcast. The repercussions didn't stop there. Her employer, a mid-tier real estate agency, released a statement condemning her actions. By the end of the week, Karen found herself without a job. Her name now synonymous with the very thing she had once accused Oscar of being, a public menace. For years, Karen had been the type of person who ruled with a false sense of superiority, the kind who smiled at her neighbors, while policing who belonged in her community. But now, those same neighbors no longer returned her greetings. Parents pulled their children away when she walked past. Doors that were once open to her slammed shut. Meanwhile, Oscar's world shifted in an entirely different way. What had started as an evening walk turned into something much larger, an outpouring of support from the very people Karen had hoped would turn against him. It started with small gestures. A knock on the door, a neighbor offering homemade cookies. A handwritten letter from an elderly couple down the street, apologizing for not stepping in sooner. And then, the bigger ones. The local coffee shop where Oscar stopped every morning put up a sign, "Jack's coffee is always free." A nearby law firm offered to represent him pro bono if Karen ever attempted to retaliate legally. And then there was the Homeowners Association, the same one that had harbored Karen's influence for years, now rallying behind Oscar, offering a public statement of solidarity, and promising to ensure their community was a place of true inclusivity. But perhaps the most meaningful show of support came from Jack himself. Loyal as ever, the golden retriever stuck even closer to Oscar's side in the days that followed. His presence a steady reminder that love, real love, the kind that isn't bound by prejudice or fear, was something Karen would never truly understand. One evening, as Oscar and Jack took their usual walk, he noticed something different. People smiled at him, real smiles, ones filled with warmth rather than wary politeness. A woman jogging past slowed down just enough to say, "Glad you're still here." A group of kids waved at Jack, laughing as the retriever wagged his tail enthusiastically. Karen had tried to paint him as a danger, an outsider. Instead, she had only revealed the depths of her own cruelty. And in doing so, she had unwittingly strengthened the very sense of community she had sought to manipulate. As Oscar looked around, feeling the weight of the past few days begin to ease, he realized something profound. She had lost everything, but he had won something far greater: belonging. The world kept turning, but for Karen, it had come to a screeching halt. Her name was now a cautionary tale, whispered in hushed tones and spoken with disdain. She had once believed she owned her neighborhood, that she had the power to dictate who belonged and who didn't. But the very community she had tried to manipulate had turned against her. The people who had once tolerated her superiority now saw her for what she truly was: an agent of division, a relic of an outdated world. Meanwhile, Oscar continued his walks with Jack, the same way he always had. But something had shifted. There was no longer a sense of isolation. No wary glances thrown his way. The neighborhood, once a place of silent, unspoken barriers, had changed. People nodded when he passed, some stopping to chat, others offering small but meaningful gestures: an open door, a wave, a moment of recognition that he was not just tolerated but welcomed. The story of what happened became more than just a viral moment. It became a lesson. A mirror held up to society. Conversations that had once been avoided were now being had. Parents sat their children down and explained why what Karen did was wrong. Community meetings addressed the unspoken biases that had lingered for too long. The HOA, once an extension of Karen's influence, implemented new policies to ensure no one could use their position the way she had. And Oscar? He didn't revel in Karen's downfall. Nor did he waste time thinking about her fate. He had learned long ago that carrying resentment only weighed a person down. Instead, he focused on something greater. He started speaking at local events, sharing his story not to shame, not to condemn, but to teach. He spoke about the importance of standing up, of not letting fear dictate one's actions, of the power in knowing your own worth. And people listened. One evening, as he sat on his porch, Jack resting at his feet, a young boy from the neighborhood approached, hesitant but curious. "Mr. Oscar?" the boy asked, shifting nervously. Oscar looked up with a warm smile. "Yeah?" The boy kicked at the ground before glancing at Jack. "My mom told me what happened. She said some people think they're better than others just because of, you know." Oscar's smile softened. "Yeah," he said simply. The boy hesitated, "But she also said you showed everyone that wasn't true." Oscar felt a warmth spread through his chest. He nodded, reaching down to scratch behind Jack's ears. "I guess so." The boy grinned. "She said I should always treat people right, no matter what." Oscar chuckled. "She's a smart lady." The boy nodded enthusiastically before glancing at Jack again. "Can I pet him?" Oscar gestured toward Jack, who, as always, was more than happy to make a new friend. As the boy laughed, running his fingers through the golden retriever's fur, Oscar looked around at the place he called home. It wasn't perfect. It never had been. But it was better now than it was before. And that, he realized, was enough. Because change didn't come in grand, sweeping gestures. It came in moments like these. It came in lessons learned, in biases challenged, in bridges rebuilt. And in the end, the real victory wasn't in Karen's downfall. It was in the world she left behind finally beginning to heal.